Hi, I'm Will here from Colorado Springs, Colorado, here at Midnight Games. We're going to do a Magic Talk, where we talk about everything Magic the Gathering. Today we're doing Ice Age, which was a special edition released in 1995. We're going to open these two pristine packs that have never been touched before, and we are going to look through them, and I will be explaining things like what certain cards do. They didn't actually have things like haste back then. Instead, it would say things like, this creature is unaffected by summoning sickness, and I will explain more as we go along. All right then, so here we are opening up the box. As you can see, it's still wrapped. So now I've got another wrapping to take off. It's gonna be me fighting with wrappers all day, you know? So, we got our cards open finally. It didn't take me long, I swear. It only took like 5 seconds.
Yeah.
All right, so these were your side deck, and this was your deck, basically. It was a starter edition for Ice Age. And we're gonna go through here and see what we gathered, because everything could be different, so you could build a deck yourself. Now, over here in this side deck, we have Nature's Love, which was search your library for any forest and put it directly into play. This does not count towards your 1 land per turn limit. Reshuffle your library afterwards. See, before, everyone had to explain what it did. Nowadays, you guys just say, oh, I get this land. I can use this card and get this land, and now I've got extra land. But back then, we had to be specific. Next is a creature called Phantasmal Mount. I mean, these are a lot of cards you haven't really seen before. They're pretty old. And this one was a flying, had a tap ability. Target creature you control, which has toughness less than 3, gains flying and gets +1/+1 until end of turn. Other effects may later be used to increase the creature's toughness beyond 3. If Phantasmal Mount leaves play before end of turn, bury the creature. Now, bury was a different term. It was basically your creature going to the graveyard. That's what bury meant. It wasn't what we say now is your creature just goes to the graveyard. No, you were burying that creature. Essentially, it was in the ground. And that's how the game was initially played. It was more in line with D&D as a card version, but not a lot of people think that way. If the creature leaves play before end of turn, bury Phantasmal Mount. So you would have to get rid of this card as well. Next we have Ashen Ghoul, which was a black creature. And another thing about this is that it actually said summon and what type of creature it was, not, just creature and what type of creature it was. They were all considered summons. You were basically summoning creatures to battle. Ashen Ghoul can attack the turn it comes into play. That is a version of what you now know as haste. Haste didn't really exist, it just existed in word form. And then you tap a swamp, return Ashen Ghoul to play under your control. Use this ability only at the end of your upkeep, and only if Ashen Ghoul is in your graveyard with at least 3 creature cards above it. So you would have to wait until you had 3 other creatures on top of this creature. But if you paid a swamp, it would come back. Basically, that was the form of regenerate back then. Next is an artifact called Icy Manipulator. Now, Icy Manipulator took 1 mana, didn't matter what kind of mana, you just paid the mana, tapped the card, and tapped target artifact, creature, or land. So you could take control of your opponent's land and make them tap it, especially if they only have 1 left. It became very useful. Sunstone is another artifact. This one requires 2 mana. Sacrifice a snow-covered land, which we'll get to later. There will be some in this. To have all creatures deal no damage in combat this turn. So you could keep this out, tap 2 mana, and then sacrifice a snow-covered land, any type, and then none of your creatures would take any damage. Next is Order of the White Shield. This was a creature, 2/1. Protection from black. Now, this creature's first ability was you tapped 1 plains. When you tapped plains, it gained first strike until end of turn. If you tapped 2 additional plains, it also gained +1/+0 until end of turn. Now, you could tap as many mana as you had into that second ability to increase its power as much as you could. Next is a card called Soul Barrier. It's an enchantment. Whenever target opponent casts a summon spell, Soul Barrier deals 2 damage to him or her. That player may pay 2 to prevent this damage. So anytime someone decided to cast a creature, which was called summon spells back then, once again, then they would take damage unless they paid an additional 2 mana to prevent that damage, also crippling the mana. Next is what was called an interrupt. This is what nowadays is called an instant. Interrupt is called Force Void. Counter target spell unless that spellcaster pays an additional 1. Draw a card at the beginning of the next turn's upkeep. Now, this isn't like the cards we have nowadays where you just get to draw a card right after playing your spell. No, you had to wait until your next upkeep to be able to draw that card. But that means you get to draw twice. Withering Wisp is another enchantment. It's a black enchantment this time. The last one was blue. At the end of any turn, if there are no creatures in play, bury Withering Wisp. Again, send it to the graveyard. Tap 1 swamp. Withering Wisp deals 1 damage to each creature and each player. You cannot spend more than 1 swamp in this way each turn than the number of snow-covered swamps you control. So the more snow-covered swamps you had, the more damage you could do to your opponent and to the creatures. Hot Springs is an enchant land. When Hot Springs comes into play, choose target land you control. Tap no mana. Tap land Hot Springs enchants to prevent 1 damage to any creature or player. And we have a couple more artifacts here. Goblin Leer. You didn't have to spend any mana to use its ability, but you sacrifice Goblin Leer, flip a coin. Target opponent calls heads or tails while a coin is in the air. If the flip ends up in your favor, Goblin Leer deals star damage to that opponent, where star is equal to the number of creatures you control. Otherwise, Goblin Leer deals star damage to you, where star is equal to the number of creatures the opponent controls. So this was a 50-50 shot to do damage to your opponent or to yourself. Next is Elkin Bottle. Elkin Bottle, you would tap 3 mana. Take the top card from your library and place it face up in front of you. You may play that card as though it were in your hand. If you do not play it by your next upkeep, remove it from the game. So essentially you got an extra card from your deck and you were able to use it right away. But if you couldn't, you had to get rid of it. You removed it from the game, which was, again, another way of saying exile, before exile was a thing. And these are some of the lands in the box here. As you can see, there's a forest. This is the artwork that they had in the Ice Age, which I think was one of the better artworks in Magic. This was the plains. Here we have the swamp. And this is a snow-covered, but it's a mountain. So you use it for mountain, but it was a snow-covered land. Which if your opponent had snow walk, it would hurt, because they could walk right up to you and just hit you directly. You couldn't walk. This right here was the island from the Ice Age series. Again, the artwork on this was one of the better sets, in my own opinion. This was the snow-covered plains. Again, it's just the plains, but it was a snow-covered. Here we have the snow-covered swamp. We also have a snow-covered island, as well as a snow-covered forest. Well, next up is a creature known as Dire Wolves. It's a forest creature, costs 3 to summon, and this one gains banding if you control any planes. So if you have any planes in your possession, it would gain banding. Now, banding was a form of effect that your creatures basically got together. They became one creature, and then after all damage was dealt, you disperse the damage amongst the creatures that you banded with. Now we have an enchant creature. Target creature gets +3/+0. If that creature attacks, no other creatures can attack this turn. So it would have to attack alone. Now, here's a woolly mammoth. Again, snow-covered lands come into play. As long as you control any snow-covered lands, this creature gains trample. Now, cumulative upkeep was not what everyone thought, okay? So a cumulative upkeep means that you had to tap mana and keep that mana tapped to keep the card into play. And every turn you had to increase the tap. Cumulative upkeep starts at 1 island. Tap 1, target creature gains flying until end of turn. So you could give any creature flying, but if you didn't keep up with your upkeep, then the card would get buried. Okay, here's an enchant creature right here that's swamp, costs only 2. You would essentially put this on your own creature. If the target creature you control attacks and is not blocked, you may choose to have it deal no damage to defending player this turn. If you do so, that player discards a card at random from his or her hand. Ignore this ability if that player has no cards in their hand. So basically, anytime you would do damage to them, you could choose whether or not to give them the damage or make them discard a card. Now this was a creature that I hated back in the day. This was a flying creature and had banding at first strike. So it could band together with the other creatures and beef itself up to hit you for way more damage. Or it could block way more damage than it could before because it's only over 1/1. But it has first strike, so it would get the first hit. Summon Wolverine, tap Mountain. Anytime you tap a mountain, +2/+0 until end turn. Use this ability only when a creature is assigned to block Grizzled Wolverine, and only once each turn. So, you tap 1 mana, this thing would go to a 4/2 if someone decided to block you, and this was basically another version of Interrupt, but as an ability. That's a good card. Okay, so here we got an actual pretty good card here. It's called Circle of Protection Blue. For every mana you tap, prevent all damage against you from 1 blue source. If a blue source deals damage to you more than once in a turn, you may pay 1 each time to prevent the damage. So every time someone tries to hit you with a blue card, you can just tap 1 mana and stop that damage. There are also circle protections for red, white, black, green, and artifacts. So you can essentially block anything but a colorless creature. Here we have a sorcery. We haven't talked about sorceries yet. This is the first one we've actually gotten, and I'm kind of surprised after those other cards. It's a black sorcery that only costs 2, Gaze of Pain. For each creature you control that attacks and is not blocked, you may choose to have it deal no damage to the defending player this turn. If you do so, it instead deals damage equal to its power to any target creature. So essentially it's like that other card that made them discard a card, but instead it targets a creature by itself. So you can kill an opponent's creature even if they didn't block. So this one, if your opponent would control any snow-covered lands, would essentially become unblockable. This is how it was worded back then. If defending player controls any snow-covered lands, no creature with power greater than 1 may assign to block Arctic Foxes. And here is another sorcery. This one is a green, costs 2 forests and 1 of any color. Destroy all enchantments or destroy all non-white enchantments. Pestilence Rats. This was a rat. Pestilence Rats has power equal to the total number of other rats in play, no matter who controls them. For example, as long as there are 2 other rats in play, Pestilence Rats has power and toughness 2/3. This was a very good rat if you were trying to build a rat deck back in the 90s. Nowadays, people don't really go towards rats because they're not as good as they were back then. Pardon me. Alright, so right here we have another interrupt. It's a counter target spell, so that meant any spell. It could have been a summon spell, it could have been an instant, it could have been a sorcery, it could have been an enchantment, enchant land, it didn't matter. You would counter that card unless someone else had to counter against your counter, which was back then not that often. Not many people had that many counters. No one really veered towards them at the time. It was all about power and toughness. Here you have a creature called Morphine. It has what we call Swamp Walk. Essentially, you would, anytime an opponent had a swamp out on the field, you could just go over there and straight up attack them. It was a 3/3 that only cost 4. Again, the artwork on this is so much better than anything else that I've seen lately anyway. There are some good artworks out there, but I believe Ice Age is one of the better ones, in my opinion. Here we have a white instant, again, instant, interrupt, they were all the same thing, called Death Ward. Regenerate target creature, and it only costs a single planes. Again, cards back then were a little cheaper to use abilities like that than they are nowadays, where it costs like 4 to do something that did this. But a lot of these cards are banned. Actually, pretty much all these cards are banned. You can't really use them in any decks. They're just, good collector cards. And you don't see many of them anymore. Battle Frenzy was another instant. All green creatures you control get +1/+1 until end of turn. All non-green creatures you control get +1/+0 until end of turn. This is if you were to build a red-green deck, which was actually a well-balanced deck in the 90s. And this was another card right here that you don't really see many that do this certain ability, and it only costs 3, but you do destroy target land. So any opponent's land, or if you need to get rid of a land yourself for another ability, this is a way to do it. So you would essentially get rid of your opponent's lands. Look at target player's hand. Draw a card at the beginning of the next upkeep. You can see what your opponent had, and it only cost 1 island. So you could prepare a counter for whatever you thought was coming next. So here was a version of Menace combined with another ability, which was that it could not attack alone. Orcish Conscripts only cost 1 mountain to cast. It's a 2/2. Cannot be declared as attacking unless at least 2 other creatures are also declared as attacking, which was, the can't attack alone. Here's the Menace. Cannot be assigned to block unless at least 2 other creatures are also assigned to block. This was a different form of Menace. It wasn't really your opponent had to block with 2, it was that you couldn't block alone. Gorilla Pack. Gorilla Pack was a summon gorilla. Gorilla Pack cannot enter if defending player controls no forest. Bury Gorilla Pack if you control no forest. So if your opponent was able to get rid of your forest, you would have to get this and send it to the graveyard. But if your opponent controlled no forest, you would immediately have to bury it. There were some good cards, there were some not so good cards. Summon Zombies. Gangerous Zombies. Tap. Sacrifice Gangerous Zombies to have it deal 1 damage to each creature and player. If you control any snow-covered swamps, Gangerous Zombies instead deals 2 damage to each creature and player. So it cost 3 to come out, it was a 2/2, but its ability is what made it worth it. Yes, you would lose it, but you would do damage to your opponent as well as the creature. So if they had a bunch of 2/2s or less out there, they were dead. Aurochs. Aurochs was another creature. It was 2/3 green, cost 4 to bring out. It had trample. When attacking, Aurochs gets +1/+0 for each other Aurochs that attacks. So the more of these that you had on the field, the more damage you could do with it. And it had trample, so that means even if they blocked, they would still take damage. Another instant, this one is a blind. Tap 3, 2, and a swamp. Bury target non-black creature. So you could get rid of one of your opponent's creatures. Barbarian Guides was a mountain creature. Cost 2 and a mountain. You tap 2 and a mountain and tapped. Target creature you control gains a snow-covered land walk ability of your choice until end of turn. At end of turn, return that creature to its owner's hand. So you could essentially attack your opponent directly as long as they had a snow-covered land. Didn't matter which one it was. You just named a color, said, okay, that's the one. After that, then you had to take the creature and put it back in your hand. If you had enough mana to bring it back out, great. But if not, you had to wait until your next turn. Finally, we have Zuron Spellcaster. Taps 3. Tap 2 and an island. You tap Zuron Spellcaster, deals 1 damage to target creature or player. Every time you tap this, it deals 1 damage. So you don't have to attack with it. It's a little 1/1. You don't have to attack with it at all. You just sit there and just do damage to your opponent. And that's all we have for you today. Be sure to check in with us next time. We'll try to get some more older cards in. Maybe we can get some older than Ice Age in. We'll see what happens. Be sure to like and subscribe and check out the Facebook page at Midnight Games LLC. That is the official Facebook page. Link will be in the description. Thank you.